"Don't admit her," the nurse said, loud enough for the waiting room to hear. "She's wasting our time." Zoe Parker stood hunched over the ER counter, one hand pressed to her chest, the other gripping the plastic edge so hard her fingers shook. "I can't breathe," she forced out. The head triage nurse, Denise Holloway, didn't even stand. She glanced at Zoe's student hoodie, then at the crowded lobby behind her. "Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates." "Panic attack," Denise said flatly. "It's asthma," Zoe whispered. "My inhaler isn't working." A younger nurse stepped closer with a pulse oximeter clipped to Zoe's finger. Her face changed when the number appeared. "Denise," she said quietly, "her oxygen is." Denise snapped her eyes toward her. "I said she's stable." The younger nurse froze. Zoe looked from one woman to the other, realizing the person with power in that room had already decided what she was worth. Denise typed something into the computer and waved a doctor over. 19-year-old female, anxious, mild shortness of breath, vitals acceptable. Zoe tried to speak, but her chest tightened again. The doctor barely glanced at her. "Rest, fluids, follow up with primary care." "I don't have one," Zoe said. Denise pushed discharge papers across the counter. The waiting room went blurry around Zoe as she took them. Outside, cold night air hit her face. She dialed Marcus, her older brother. "Zoe, what happened?" "They sent me home," she said, trying to sound normal. "You still sound bad." "I'm fine," she lied, because making trouble had never felt safe to her. By the time Zoe reached her apartment, each step felt heavier. She dropped her keys twice before getting inside. Her inhaler rattled in her hand. One puff. Nothing, another, still nothing. She stumbled toward the couch, but her knees folded first. From the other side of the wall, someone banged hard. "Zoe," her neighbor shouted. "Zoe, open the door." Zoe tried to answer. No sound came out. Then the pounding became frantic. "I'm calling 911. Zoe woke to a sharp mechanical beeping, and the feeling of something lodged in her throat. She jerked instinctively, panic flashing through her body. Hey, don't move," a voice said quickly. A nurse leaned over her. "You're in the ICU. You were intubated." The words barely registered. "ICU. Intubated." Her chest burned. Her arms felt heavy. Tubes ran from both hands. Then she saw Marcus sitting in the corner. He looked exhausted. The second he noticed her eyes open, he stood so fast his chair scraped across the floor. "Jesus, Zoe." His voice cracked. "What happened?" she mouthed weakly around the tube. Marcus rubbed both hands over his face before answering. "Your neighbor found you unconscious. Paramedics said your oxygen was critically low by the time they got there." Zoe stared at him. "But the hospital said I was okay." Marcus let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, then why were you minutes away from respiratory arrest?" She looked away. Even now, lying in intensive care, part of her wanted to defend them. "The ER was busy," she whispered later after the breathing tube was removed. "Maybe I didn't explain it right." Marcus turned toward her so fast she stopped talking. "You could barely stand," he said. "You called me gasping for air." He lowered his voice, trying to contain his anger. "They sent you home anyway." 2 days later, someone knocked softly on Zoe's ICU door. The younger nurse from the ER stepped inside. "Olivia." She looked nervous before the door even closed behind her. "I shouldn't really be here," she admitted quietly. Zoe studied her face. "You were there." Olivia nodded. For a second, she said nothing. Then the apology came out all at once. "I tried to tell Denise your oxygen levels were dropping. She told me not to overreact." Marcus stood immediately. "What?" Olivia flinched. "She kept saying there weren't enough beds," Olivia continued. "She told us not to admit patients unless they were crashing." Zoe felt cold despite the blankets. "I heard alarms," Zoe said slowly. In triage. Olivia hesitated. Then she glanced toward the hallway before leaning closer. The chart they discharged you with, she whispered, doesn't match what I saw on the monitor. Marcus stared at her. Are you saying somebody changed it? Olivia didn't answer directly. But the silence did. Weeks later, after Zoe finally returned home, a formal hospital letter arrived. After internal review, it read, all procedures were followed appropriately. Zoe sat at her kitchen table, rereading the report. Normal oxygen saturation. Mild anxiety symptoms. Stable condition. None of it matched what happened. Her hands trembled as she looked up at Marcus. I know what I heard, she said. Before Marcus could answer, her phone buzzed. A message from Olivia. 3 words. Those weren't your numbers. 4 years later, Zoe Parker walked back into the same hospital through the employee entrance. This time, nobody handed her discharge papers. People moved out of her way. A silver badge hung from her neck. Director of Patient Safety Compliance. As she crossed the emergency department floor, conversations lowered around her. That's her. The audit woman. I heard she came from corporate. Zoe kept walking. The ER looked almost identical to the night she nearly died. Same harsh lighting, same crowded hallways, same triage desk. And standing beside it was Denise Holloway. Still in charge. Denise was leading a staff efficiency briefing when Zoe entered the room quietly and took a seat near the back. We cannot afford unnecessary admissions during high-volume intake periods, Denise said confidently. Patient flow depends on decisive triage. Then the department administrator cleared his throat. Before we continue, I'd like everyone to meet the new compliance director overseeing the state review. Denise turned casually and froze. Zoe met her eyes calmly. We've actually met before, Zoe said. The room went silent. Denise recovered quickly, forcing a professional smile. Of course, welcome aboard. But her voice had changed. Too careful. Over the next week, Zoe reviewed archived complaints connected to the ER during the same month she collapsed. Patterns started appearing immediately. Respiratory patients discharged unusually fast. Repeated complaints about ignored symptoms. Missing reassessment notes. One case ended in emergency hospitalization less than 6 hours after discharge. Then another. Late one evening, a senior hospital administrator closed Zoe's office door. You're digging into very old incidents, he said carefully. Zoe looked up from the files. That's my job. There were capacity problems back then. State penalties were hanging over the department. Nobody wants those years reopened. That sentence stayed with her. Capacity penalties. The next morning, Zoe requested original triage logs from the records department. The technician frowned while pulling them up. That's strange. What? Several entries from that week were manually overwritten. Zoe leaned forward. One of them was hers. Hours later, a formal audit meeting filled with department staff and administrators began downstairs. Olivia, now a registered nurse, sat near the end of the table, visibly tense. Denise arrived late and immediately spotted her. You brought staff into this, Denise asked sharply. Zoe remained calm. We're reviewing patient safety concerns. Denise's expression hardened. Or settling personal grudges. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Then Olivia spoke up quietly. I remember Zoe's case. Denise turned toward her instantly. Be careful what you imply. That was enough. Zoe opened a folder and slid printed records across the table. Then explain, she said evenly, why my chart was altered. By the next morning, the hospital was in chaos. Internal investigators moved through administration offices, carrying archive boxes, while department heads whispered in corners. Staff, who normally avoided eye contact with compliance officers, suddenly stopped talking when Zoe walked past. Denise Holloway, however, acted untouched. "It was a routine correction," she said during questioning. "Timestamps get adjusted constantly in emergency medicine." But the investigator across from her slid a printed audit log onto the table. "Your login accessed Zoe Parker's chart 3 minutes before discharge," he said. "The oxygen readings changed immediately afterward." For the first time, Denise stopped speaking. Downstairs, Olivia sat in a conference room giving a recorded statement. "She told us not to admit patients unless they were actively crashing," Olivia said quietly. "She kept saying we couldn't lose more beds." "Did doctors know charts were being edited?" an investigator asked. Olivia shook her head. Most of them trusted triage summaries. The ER was overloaded. That afternoon, Zoe met with Dr. Leonard Graves, the physician who signed her discharge papers 4 years earlier. Now retired, he looked sick when he reviewed the original monitor data. "I never saw these numbers," he said slowly. Zoe watched him carefully. "Then what did you see?" He swallowed hard. "A chart that said mild anxiety symptoms, stable oxygen saturation." He removed his glasses, staring at the floor. "If these readings had been there, I would have admitted you immediately." Word of the investigation spread fast. Some staff quietly supported Zoe. Others blamed her openly. "You're destroying this hospital," one nurse snapped as Zoe crossed the ER hallway. "No," Zoe replied. "I'm finding out who already did." Then another former patient came forward publicly about being discharged during a respiratory emergency that same month. Local reporters picked up the story within hours. By evening, camera crews waited outside the hospital entrance. Public trust started collapsing. But the final piece came from an old budgeting file Zoe found buried in archived administration records. Weeks before her collapse, Denise had approved aggressive staffing cuts in the emergency department. Attached emails showed repeated warnings about overcrowding violations. One message stood out. "If admission numbers rise again, administration will review departmental leadership." Zoe stared at the screen. It had never been about one patient. Denise had been protecting herself. That night, an emergency board hearing was called. Denise entered the conference room expecting support from administrators she'd worked beside for years. Instead, 2 state investigators sat waiting with stacks of printed audit logs. The room was silent, except for the sound of papers sliding across the table. Slowly, Denise looked up. Across from her sat Zoe. Denise's face tightened. "You remembered everything." The board hearing lasted nearly 6 hours. By the end of the first hour, nobody in the room was defending Denise anymore. State investigators projected archived monitor data onto a large screen at the front of the conference room. Numbers filled the display beside timestamps from the night Zoe arrived at the ER. Oxygen saturation, critically low. Respiratory distress warnings. Repeated monitor alarms. Then investigators pulled up the discharge chart Denise submitted minutes later. Mild anxiety symptoms. Stable condition. Safe for discharge. A silence settled over the room that felt heavier than shouting. One investigator spoke carefully. The original monitor records were preserved on backup servers. They directly contradict the final triage report. Denise sat rigidly in her chair. "We were under impossible pressure," she said finally. "The department was drowning." Another investigator opened a folder of internal emails. "You repeatedly warned administration that overcrowding penalties would damage your department rankings," he replied. Then admissions numbers suddenly dropped despite rising ER traffic. Page after page showed the same pattern. Admissions avoided. Charts modified. Doctors relying on incomplete summaries. Zoe listened without interrupting. The truth no longer sounded like a mistake. It sounded calculated. Olivia spoke next, her voice shaking. I should have reported it sooner, she admitted. But everyone knew Denise controlled scheduling, evaluations, everything. People were scared. Denise looked toward her sharply. You're acting like I forced people. You told us not to waste beds on patients who could still walk. Olivia shot back. The room went quiet again. Then Zoe finally spoke. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just clearly. I remember trying to tell you I couldn't breathe, she said, looking directly at Denise. You decided what I was before you even examined me. Denise opened her mouth, but Zoe continued. I woke up on a ventilator because protecting your numbers mattered more than checking my chart twice. Even the board members looked unsettled now. One of them asked Denise directly, did you knowingly alter patient records to avoid admissions reviews? Denise didn't answer immediately. That hesitation answered for her. Within days, the fallout spread beyond the hospital. Denise's nursing license was suspended, pending permanent revocation. Executives connected to staffing concealment resigned under investigation. Multiple former patients filed legal claims after discovering similar discharge patterns. News stations ran stories for weeks about hospitals manipulating patient flow statistics to protect performance ratings. Outside the courthouse after one hearing, Marcus stood beside Zoe watching reporters crowd around the entrance. I kept thinking nobody would ever listen, he admitted. Zoe looked toward the cameras for a moment before answering. Honestly, I almost stopped trying. After surviving the night she collapsed, she'd considered leaving healthcare behind completely. Instead, she studied healthcare administration, patient advocacy, safety compliance. Everything she once trusted blindly, she learned to question. Months later, Zoe stood behind the glass observation window, overlooking the same emergency room. But the department operated differently now. Every respiratory complaint required a second review. Independent audits checked triage decisions weekly. Anonymous reporting systems protected nurses who raised concerns. During a crowded evening shift, a teenage girl rushed through the entrance struggling to breathe. Within seconds, staff placed her on oxygen and moved her into treatment. No hesitation. No dismissal. Olivia stepped beside Zoe at the observation window and watched quietly. That wouldn't have happened before, she said. Zoe looked out at the ER where she had once begged for help while people ignored her. Then she answered softly. Now it will.